5:45 in the morning. The North Arabian Sea. USS Kearsarge was already at general quarters. Two Iranian F-4 Phantom jets had just broken radar silence, and they were not responding to warnings on the international distress frequency. The question was no longer if they would fire, but whether the ship's defensive systems could intercept the incoming sea-skimming missiles in time. The morning air was heavy and humid, smelling of salt spray and the ozone of high-powered radar arrays. Below the flight deck, the hull shuddered as the massive ship turned hard to starboard to bring its defensive weapons to bear against the approaching threat. At coordinates 24 degrees 40 minutes north, 58 degrees 15 minutes east, the tactical action officer inside the Combat Direction Center monitored the radar screens with clinical precision. Two high-speed contacts had appeared on the ANSPY-6 radar at a range of 40 miles, flying at an altitude of only 50 feet above the water's surface. The Iranian pilots had executed a pop-up maneuver before diving back to sea-skimming height, launching 4 K-800 and 2 Nor anti-ship missiles. These missiles were traveling at 0.9 times the speed of sound, leaving the crew of the 84,000-ton amphibious assault ship exactly 90 seconds to react. The commanding officer of USS Kearsarge authorized the engagement of all hostile tracks as the missiles crossed the 20-mile mark. On the starboard side of the ship, the Mark 49 guided missile launching system hummed as it slewed toward the horizon. Two rolling airframe missiles shrieked off the rails, trailing white smoke and orange flame as they climbed into the hazy morning sky. These interceptors were designed to find the heat signatures of the incoming threats, and, for a moment, the crew on the bridge watched the streaks of light race toward the incoming danger. The first rolling airframe missile successfully intercepted the lead Iranian missile at a range of 12 miles, resulting in a bright flash that momentarily bleached the gray ocean surface white. A second intercept followed 3 seconds later, destroying another K-802 missile as it attempted to execute a terminal weave maneuver. However, the remaining 2 Iranian missiles remained on target, dropping to an even lower altitude of only 15 feet to mask their approach behind the swell of the waves. At 5 miles, the ship's 2 close-in weapon systems, known as Phalanx, began their automated firing sequence. The 20mm Gatling guns rotated at 4,500 rounds per minute, sending a literal wall of tungsten shells into the air. The sound was a continuous, vibrating roar that shook the very deck plates of the ship. One of the incoming missiles was shredded by the concentrated fire, disintegrating into 1,000 pieces of burning magnesium and aluminum that skipped across the water like stones. But the final Iranian missile survived the defensive screen. It punched through the wall of lead and slammed into the starboard side of USS Kearsarge, just below the flight deck and aft of the island structure. The warhead, containing 365 pounds of high explosives, detonated inside the hangar deck. The physical impact was massive, a blunt force trauma that threw sailors to the deck and caused the entire ship to groan under the stress of the explosion. The missile had struck a staging area where several MH-60 Sierra helicopters were being readied for morning flight operations. The explosion immediately ruptured the JP-5 aviation fuel lines that ran along the overhead bulkheads. Thousands of gallons of highly flammable fuel began to pour into the hangar deck, ignited instantly by the heat of the missile's blast. Within seconds, a massive fireball erupted, rolling across the ceiling of the hangar and venting out of the elevator openings. The ship's internal communications system, the 1MC, came to life with the urgent voice of the damage control assistant. He announced a fire on the hangar deck at frame 180, calling for all damage control parties to assemble and don their protective gear. The crew of USS Kearsarge, trained for thousands of hours for this exact moment, did not panic. They moved with the disciplined speed of professionals, dragging fire hoses across the deck and activating the aqueous film-forming foam systems. Despite the rapid response, the situation was critical. The heat from the burning aviation fuel was already reaching temperatures of 1,200 degrees, threatening the structural integrity of the flight deck above. Thick, oily black smoke began to fill the lower decks, making visibility near zero. The ship was now fighting a war on 2 fronts. One against an unseen enemy in the sky, and another against the inferno growing within its own hull. 5:55 in the morning. The hangar deck of USS Kearsarge was a vision of absolute chaos, illuminated only by the flickering orange glow of burning aviation fuel and the strobing emergency lights. The air was a thick, suffocating mixture of vaporized JP-5 fuel and the sharp chemical bite of the firefighting foam, making visibility nearly impossible even with high-powered flashlights. The heat within the compartment was now pushing past 1,300 degrees, causing the gray paint on the steel bulkheads to blister and peel away in large, blackened sheets. Every few seconds, the hull groaned as the ship continued its defensive maneuvers, forcing the firefighting teams to brace themselves against the slippery, foam-covered deck. At the center of the disaster, Repair Locker 5 had established a primary attack line near frame 185. 25 sailors, clad in full gold-colored firefighting ensembles and breathing through self-contained apparatus, pushed through the smoke-filled passageway toward the source of the inferno. The team leader gripped a naval firefighting thermal imager, a device that allowed him to see the heat signatures of the fire through the dense black smoke. He signaled for the nozzlemen to open the valves, and 3 4-inch fire hoses erupted with a high-pressure stream of aqueous film-forming foam. The foam was designed to float on top of the burning fuel, cutting off the oxygen supply and cooling the metal surfaces of the deck and helicopters. As the white chemical blanket hit the fire, it created massive clouds of steam that hissed and roared, further obscuring the vision of the sailors. The sound was deafening, a combination of the rushing water, the crackling of burning composite materials, and the constant metallic clanging of the ship's emergency alarms. Despite the intensity of the heat, the damage control teams moved with mechanical discipline, leapfrogging their positions to ensure that no one stayed at the front of the fire for too long. A critical danger remained at the aft end of the hangar deck, where 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters were being staged for a medical evacuation mission. These aircraft were fully fueled and carried a complement of defensive flares and small arms ammunition that were now in danger of a sympathetic detonation. If the heat reached the internal fuel bladders of the helicopters, the resulting explosion would likely breach the flight deck above and compromise the structural integrity of the entire ship. The damage control assistant, monitoring the situation from the ship's tactical center, ordered a secondary team to establish a cooling boundary on the bulkheads surrounding the ordnance lockers. At 6:15 in the morning, the situation intensified when a secondary explosion rocked the hangar deck. A pressurized hydraulic line had ruptured, sending a spray of flammable fluid into the air that ignited instantly, creating a localized fireball that briefly overwhelmed the primary attack team. One sailor was thrown backward by the force of the blast, his protective suit scorched by the sudden increase in temperature. His teammates immediately dragged him toward the safety of the decontamination station while the remaining nozzlemen stood their ground, refusing to let the fire advance any further toward the ship's vital machinery. By 6:40 in the morning, the coordinated efforts of the damage control parties began to show results. The primary fire had been knocked down to a series of localized hotspots, and the aqueous film-forming foam now stood 3 inches deep across the entire hangar deck. The temperature had dropped to a manageable 400 degrees, although the danger of reignition remained high due to the pools of unburned fuel trapped beneath the foam. The sailors of Repair Locker 5 remained on the line, their boots submerged in the chemical slush as they began the grueling process of mechanical desmoking using large electric fans. The cost of the initial strike was becoming clear as the smoke began to clear. 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters were total losses, reduced to charred skeletons of melted aluminum and carbon fiber. The starboard side of the hangar deck was heavily scarred, with electrical cabling and piping hanging from the overheads like black vines. 11 personnel had been treated for smoke inhalation, and 3 sailors had suffered second-degree burns while defending the ordnance boundaries. However, through their professional discipline and technical skill, the crew had saved USS Kearsarge from a catastrophic loss. As the firefighting teams transitioned to the overhaul phase, the focus of the ship's command shifted back to the external threat. While the fire was being contained, the Iranian F-4 Phantoms had turned back toward the coast, but radar indicated that a much larger formation of aircraft was now spooling up at the Bandar Abbas airbase. The United States Navy was no longer merely defending a ship. It was now preparing for a full-scale regional engagement to ensure the safety of the carrier strike group and the freedom of navigation in the Arabian Sea. 6:45 in the morning. The Arabian Sea. USS Abraham Lincoln was already turning into the wind, her 4 massive bronze propellers churning the deep blue water into a white frenzy as she increased speed to 30 knots. The flagship of Carrier Strike Group 12 had received the flash message from USS Kearsarge exactly 12 minutes earlier. The morning sun was a pale orange disk, hanging low over a horizon that now felt crowded with invisible threats. On the flight deck, the air was a hurricane of sound and heat as the first wave of F-18 Super Hornets moved toward the catapults, their engines screaming against the humid sea air. The destroyer USS Mason, a high-speed sentinel of the Arleigh Burke class, was positioned 70 miles to the north. At the command of the strike group commander, the ship leaned hard into a turn, its hull slicing through the 2-meter swells at 35 knots, to take a primary station in the defensive screen. The ship was operating at coordinates 24 degrees 52 minutes north, 58 degrees 10 minutes east. Within the windowless Combat Information Center of USS Mason, the air was cool and smelled of ozone and stale coffee. The blue light from the Aegis display consoles illuminated the focused faces of the radar operators. The mission was clear: establish a multi-layered defensive bubble around the wounded USS Kearsarge and the precious carrier. The United States Navy was no longer operating in a gray zone environment of posturing. This was now a hot theater. The Aegis combat system on USS Mason was linked via satellite and Link 16 data sharing to every other ship in the strike group, creating a single, integrated picture of the airspace. Every Iranian radar signature, every civilian airliner, and every unidentified surface contact was being tracked, categorized, and assigned a threat level by the ship's computers. The commanding officer of USS Mason stood behind the tactical action officer, his eyes fixed on the large screen display. To the east, along the Iranian coastline, the AN/SPY-1 Delta radar had detected increased activity at the Bushehr and Bandar Abbas airfields. Intelligence suggested that the initial strike by the 4 Phantoms was merely a probe designed to test the reaction time of the American strike group. The real threat, a massed formation of J-10 and Su-30 fighters, was currently being fueled and armed on the mainland. Set Condition 1 throughout the ship, the commanding officer ordered. I want the Mark 41 vertical launch system ready to fire on my command. If anything crosses the 100-mile line without an IFF tag, we take it down. Across the strike group, 3 other destroyers and the cruiser USS Leyte Gulf were executing similar maneuvers. They formed a picket line, a wall of steel and sensors stretching across 50 miles of open ocean. The environment was one of deceptive calm. The water was a deep, flat blue, and the sky was clear. Yet the electromagnetic spectrum was screaming with the digital noise of modern warfare. The sailors on the upper decks could feel the vibration of the ship's gas turbine engines through the soles of their boots, a constant reminder of the thousands of horsepower driving them toward the conflict. On the flight deck of USS Abraham Lincoln, the first F-18 Super Hornet was hooked into the catapult. The pilot gave a crisp salute to the catapult officer, who knelt and pointed his arm toward the bow. With a violent hiss of steam and a jolt that compressed the pilot's spine, the 20-ton fighter was flung from 0 to 160 miles per hour in just 2 seconds. It cleared the deck, dipped slightly toward the waves, and then roared upward, its afterburners twin points of white fire against the morning sky. 11 more fighters followed in rapid succession, forming a combat air patrol that would orbit at 25,000 feet. Their job was to act as the long-range eyes of the fleet, using their active electronically scanned array radars to look deep into Iranian territory. Supporting them was an E-2 Charlie Hawkeye, the brain in the sky, which provided command and control for the entire air wing. The strategic mobilization was complete. Carrier Strike Group 12 was no longer a collection of individual ships. It was a single, lethal organism. While the crew of USS Kearsarge continued to fight the remnants of the fire on their hangar deck, the shield of the United States Navy had been lowered. The transition from peace to war had been executed in less than 30 minutes. a testament to the professional discipline of the thousands of sailors and aviators now standing watch in the North Arabian Sea. 7 in the morning. The flight deck of USS Abraham Lincoln. The air was a screaming vortex of heat and pressurized steam as the strike package for Operation Sentinel Resolve prepared for launch. The morning sun, now higher in the sky, caught the silver glint of the 12 FA-18 Super Hornets and 4 EA-18 Golf Growlers lined up like predators along the waist and bow catapults. The environment was a choreographed nightmare of controlled violence. The smell of burnt JP-5 aviation fuel was thick enough to taste, and the deck plates vibrated with the raw power of 60,000 pounds of thrust from each aircraft. The rainbow of flight deck personnel, sailors in yellow, green, blue, and red jerseys, moved with practiced, frantic precision. To an outsider, it looked like chaos. To the United States Navy, it was the most efficient machine on the planet. The grapes in purple jerseys finished the final fueling of the strike fighters, while the ordies in red made the final checks on the weapons pylons. Each Super Hornet was heavily laden for a deep strike mission, carrying 2 2,000-pound joint direct attack munitions, 4 AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles for self-defense, and 2 external fuel tanks to extend their reach over the Iranian coastline. Inside the cockpit of the lead Super Hornet, the flight-led call-sign Viper 1 adjusted his oxygen mask and ran through his final pre-flight checks. His pulse was steady, a product of 1,500 hours of flight time and dozens of carrier landings. He glanced at his wingman to the left, who gave a thumbs up. They were not just pilots today, they were the tip of the American spear, tasked with dismantling the integrated air defense system that had allowed the strike on USS Kearsarge to happen. Lincoln Bridge, Viper 1. Strike package is green across the board. Requesting taxi to Catapult 1, he transmitted. Viper 1, Lincoln Bridge. You are cleared for launch. Target coordinates have been uploaded to your mission computers. Good hunting. The yellow-shirted flight deck director signaled Viper 1 to move forward. The massive jet crept toward the catapult, its nose wheel clicking into the shuttle. The jet blast deflector, a massive steel plate, rose from the deck behind the aircraft to protect the rest of the crew from the searing exhaust. The pilot pushed the throttles forward to military power. The aircraft strained against the holdback bar, the twin engines roaring with a sound that could be heard for miles across the open water. Then came the signal. The catapult officer, kneeling low against the deck, swept his arm forward in a sharp, definitive motion. With a violent, bone-crushing jolt, the catapult fired. 300 feet of steel rail translated high-pressure steam into pure kinetic energy. The FA-18 was flung forward. The pilot's head slammed back against the seat as he experienced 5 times the force of gravity. In less than 2 seconds, the 25-ton machine went from a dead stop to 170 miles per hour. As it cleared the bow of the ship, the aircraft dipped slightly, its wings catching the thick, humid air before the afterburners engaged, with a thunderous crack that shook the surface of the sea. One by one, the rest of the strike package followed. The 4 EA-18 Golf Growlers, the electronic warfare variants of the Hornet, were launched last. These aircraft were the invisible shield of the formation, equipped with sophisticated jamming pods designed to blind enemy radar and disrupt communications. Without them, the Super Hornets would be flying into a wall of surface-to-air missiles. With them, they were ghosts in the machine. By 7:15 in the morning, all 16 aircraft had formed up in a tight V formation at 15,000 feet, banking toward the northeast. Below them, the wake of USS Abraham Lincoln stretched out like a white scar on the blue face of the Arabian Sea. To their left, the smoke from the wounded USS Kearsarge was still visible on the horizon, a grim reminder of why they were heading toward the mainland. The mission was not a simple retaliatory strike. It was a systematic suppression of enemy capabilities. The primary objectives were the coastal radar sites at Jask and the surface-to-surface missile batteries hidden in the rugged hills overlooking the Strait of Hormuz. The United States Navy was sending a clear message. The sanctuary of the Iranian coastline was gone. As the strike package crossed the 100-mile line from the coast, the pilots switched their radars to combat mode, their screens blooming with the electronic signatures of a nation preparing for war. 7:30 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman, 40 miles off the coast of Jask. The 4 EA-18 Gulf Growlers were the first to feel the invisible touch of the enemy's long-range sensors. Somewhere on the rugged coastline ahead, the HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries were searching for a target, their radar pulses sweeping across the horizon like digital searchlights. The cockpit of the lead Growler was a quiet, high-tech sanctuary, but outside, the electromagnetic spectrum was screaming with the digital noise of impending combat. The humid morning air was clear and still, giving no hint of the electronic storm that was about to break over the Iranian integrated air defense system. At coordinates 25 degrees 38 minutes north, 57 degrees 45 minutes east, the electronic warfare officers in the back seats of the Growlers began their work. Their hands moved over touchscreens and physical buttons with the speed of concert pianists. They were not looking through the canopy. They were staring into the invisible battlefield, a world defined by frequencies, pulse repetition intervals, and signal strengths. The ANALQ-99 jamming pods beneath the wings of the 4 aircraft began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that the pilots could feel through their flight suits. Viper lead. This is Raven 1. The electronic warfare lead transmitted. We have multiple nails from the coastal sites. They are attempting to achieve a track-while-scan lock on the strike group, beginning noise jamming and digital radio frequency memory deception now. With the flick of a switch, the Growlers unleashed megawatts of targeted electronic energy. To the Iranian radar operators on the ground, the clean, circular sweeps of their screens suddenly dissolved into a chaotic mess of snow and false targets. The Growlers were not just shouting over the enemy's radar. They were capturing the incoming pulses, manipulating them, and sending them back. On the Iranian displays, the 12 Super Hornets of the strike package disappeared, replaced by dozens of ghost signatures that seemed to dance across the screen in impossible directions. The effectiveness of the jamming was immediate and systematic. The Iranian HQ-9 batteries, a sophisticated surface-to-air missile system with a range of over 120 miles, were forced to switch to secondary frequencies to find a clear signal. Each time they switched, the computers on the Growlers identified the new frequency in milliseconds and slammed it with a concentrated spot jam. The electronic warfare battle was a chess match played at the speed of light, and the United States Navy held all the high ground pieces. As the strike package closed the distance to 30 miles from the coast, the Iranian air defense network became desperate. A long-range S-300 battery near Bandar Abbas attempted to use its high-powered Big Bird radar to burn through the American jamming. The pilot of Raven 1 saw the spike on his tactical display, a bright red icon indicating a high-threat radar lock. "We have a Big Bird active, 350 degrees, the electronic warfare officer shouted, initiating wideband suppression. Viper lead, you are clear to prosecute your targets. We've got the door open." The Growlers moved into a racetrack orbit, 25,000 feet above the water, acting as a massive electronic shield for the incoming Super Hornets. They were now pumping so much energy into the atmosphere that the air around the jamming pods was physically ionizing, creating a faint blue shimmer that was invisible to the naked eye, but blinding to every sensor for 200 miles. This was the digital fog of war, a controlled environment where the enemy was rendered blind and deaf, while the American pilots could see every move on the ground with absolute clarity. The tactical objective of this phase was the total suppression of the enemy's ability to coordinate a response. By jamming the microwave communication links between the radar sites and the command bunkers, the Growlers had effectively cut the head off the Iranian air defense snake. The individual missile batteries were now isolated, forced to operate in standalone mode, which made them easy prey for the high-speed anti-radiation missiles carried by the strike fighters. Below the flight path of the aircraft, the Arabian Sea remained a deep, calm blue, reflecting the morning sun. There was no smoke yet, no fire, and no sound that could be heard on the ground over the dull roar of the waves. But, in the unseen world of the electromagnetic spectrum, A massive American fist had just slammed into the Iranian coast, shattering its glass jaw. The path was now open for the 12 Super Hornets to begin the kinetic phase of the operation. 7:40 in the morning. The tactical display in the cockpit of Viper 1 shifted from a search pattern to a high-intensity combat track, 200 miles per hour faster than the speed of sound. The 12 FA-18 Super Hornets of Carrier Air Wing 7 were crossing the invisible line into sovereign Iranian airspace. At an altitude of 28,000 feet, the air was thin and freezing, but inside the pressurized cockpit, the pilot felt only the sweat pooling under his flight helmet and the heavy pull of 4 Gs. As he banked toward the northeast, the sky was a brilliant, pitiless blue, and the glare of the rising sun forced him to rely almost entirely on his digital helmet-mounted display, which projected a green and yellow world of data over his vision. Viper led. Raven 1. The electronic warfare officer in the Growler transmitted. "We have 4 bogies climbing fast, out of Bandar Abbas. Bullseye 090, for 40 miles. They are Iranian F-14 Tomcats. They are painting you with their AWG-9 fire control radar. They are hot and hostile." The Iranian interceptors, relics of a previous era but still lethal in the hands of desperate pilots, were attempting to intercept the American strike package before it could reach the coastal radar sites. Through the Link 16 data network, every pilot in the American formation saw the same 4 red icons on their screens. The United States Navy pilots did not need to speak. They moved in a choreographed ballet of air superiority, split into 3 groups of 4 to enshrine the enemy in a lethal wall of lead. The environment within the cockpit was a silent, high-tech sanctuary, the only sound being the rhythmic hiss of the pilot's oxygen mask and the occasional digital chirp of a sensor. Viper 1 checked his range, 30 miles. He selected the lead Iranian target on his touchscreen display and heard the high-pitched, steady digital tone of a solid radar lock. He squeezed the red trigger on his control stick. With a violent whoosh that vibrated through the entire airframe, an AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missile shrieked off the underwing rail. A brilliant plume of white smoke and orange fire punched backward, momentarily obscuring the pilot's view of the brown Iranian coastline. The missile accelerated instantly to 4 times the speed of sound, its own active radar seeker waking up to guide it toward the kill, as it burned a white line across the sky. 20 seconds later, the warhead found its mark. The AIM-120 slammed into the belly of the lead Iranian F-14, just as the pilot attempted a desperate high-G brake to the left. The explosion was not a single sound, but a catastrophic structural failure of 60,000 pounds of metal. The 15-pound blast fragmentation warhead shredded the Tomcat's titanium wing sweep mechanism and tore through the left engine intake. A massive orange fireball erupted in the center of the aircraft, sending thousands of pieces of jagged aluminum and carbon fiber spinning into the thin atmosphere. The 60-foot-long fighter jet simply ceased to exist as a single object, turning instead into a falling rain of burning debris that streaked toward the dark waters of the Gulf of Oman, leaving an oily black smudge against the clear morning sky. The 3 remaining Iranian pilots reacted with a mix of panic and practiced desperation. The wingman of the lead Tomcat punched out hundreds of magnesium flares and clouds of aluminum chaff, creating a series of false white suns behind his tail to distract any following missiles. He pulled his nose up into a vertical climb, his twin engines pouring black smoke as he pushed them into full afterburner, trying to reach the thin air, where his heavier aircraft might have an aerodynamic advantage. He wrenched his stick back, fighting the crushing pressure of 9 Gs, his vision narrowing as the blood was forced out of his brain. But the Super Hornets were already closing the gap, their superior avionics predicting his every move. 2 more American pilots fired, their missiles tracing intersecting white lines across the blue sky toward the fleeing targets. The sky was now a graveyard of smoke and fire. 3 out of the 4 Iranian interceptors had been neutralized in less than 60 seconds. The final Tomcat, seeing his formation obliterated, and his wingmen, falling in flames, rolled his aircraft onto its back and dove toward the deck, fleeing back toward the safety of the mainland's surface-to-air missile umbrella. He did not look back at the 3 columns of black smoke marking where his comrades had fallen. The airwaves, once filled with aggressive Iranian radio traffic, went dead silent for 5 seconds before erupting in a chaotic series of panicked shouts from the ground controllers. At Bandar Abbas, Viper 1 leveled his wings, the pressure on his chest easing as he leveled off. The air-to-air threat was temporarily settled, but the primary targets, the radar sites and missile batteries that had threatened USS Kearsarge, remained. The door that the Growlers had opened was now being held wide by the wreckage of the Iranian interceptors. The Super Hornets transitioned back to their ground attack profiles, descending to 15,000 feet, to begin their run on the JASC radar complex. The environment around the aircraft was now one of surreal stillness. Below, the coast of Iran appeared as a rugged, sun-baked landscape of brown rock and white sand. There were no signs of life, only the long shadows of the mountains, stretching toward the sea. The pilots could see the white surf breaking against the cliffs, a peaceful image that contradicted the digital carnage they had just unleashed. The mission was only halfway complete, and the most dangerous part, the low-level strike against heavily defended ground targets, was about to begin. 7:45 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman, 15 miles south of the Iranian coastline. USS Leyte Gulf was maintaining a steady course of 090 degrees at 20 knots, her hull cutting through the calm, glass-like water. The horizon was a sharp, hazy line, where the heat of the rising sun began to distort the view of the rugged Iranian cliffs. Something broke the stillness of the radar display. 4 high-speed surface-to-surface contacts had just launched from the dunes near Bandar Abbas. The air in the Combat Information Center was cool, smelling of ozone, and the quiet, professional tension of sailors who knew that the next 60 seconds would define their mission. The Iranian coastal batteries had fired 4 HY-2 Silkworm missiles, heavy-hitting weapons carrying 1,000 pounds of high explosives in each warhead. These missiles were lumbering at high subsonic speeds, hugging the surface of the water at an altitude of only 30 feet to avoid detection. The commanding officer of USS Leyte Gulf, a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, authorized the immediate engagement of all 4 threats using the Aegis weapon system. Batteries release, designated tracks 104 through 107, the tactical action officer commanded, his voice steady over the internal ship's circuit. Inside the forward Mark 41 vertical launch system, the rocket motors of 4 Standard Missile 2 interceptors ignited with a thunderous roar. The armored hatches flipped open, and 4 white streaks of fire punched upward into the morning sky, leaving behind a dense, swirling cloud of acrid white smoke. The heat from the launch was so intense that it scorched the non-skid coating on the deck plates, and the physical shockwave vibrated through every steel bulkhead in the ship. The missiles climbed vertically for exactly 2 seconds before their guidance systems kicked in, pitching them over toward the horizon at 3 times the speed of sound. The first Standard Missile 2 found its target, 10 miles from the ship, its blast fragmentation warhead detonating with surgical precision. The resulting explosion was a massive orange sphere that momentarily blotted out the sun, sending thousands of white-hot steel pellets through the Silkworm's fuel tank. The Iranian missile erupted instantly, its heavy airframe snapping in 2 as the remaining liquid propellant ignited in a secondary flash of blinding light. Debris, consisting of burning engine components and twisted fuselage sections, rained down into the sea, creating a series of white splashes across the dark water. On the Iranian shoreline, the mobile Silkworm launchers attempted to reposition behind a rocky outcrop to avoid the inevitable American counterstrike. The crews frantically worked the hydraulic levers, their boots kicking up clouds of dry desert sand as they tried to fold the massive launch rails for transport. But the USS Leyte Gulf was already tracking the exact coordinates of the launch site using satellite-linked infrared sensors. 2 Tomahawk cruise missiles, launched moments earlier from the cruiser's aft deck, adjusted their flight paths to home in on the heat signatures of the retreating vehicles. A twin pillar of black smoke rose from the coastal dunes as the Tomahawk warheads found their mark, obliterating the launchers and the black, surrounding command bunkers. The Iranian radio net for the coastal defense sector went silent, replaced by the crackle of static and the distant, muffled sound of secondary ammunition cook-offs. A heavy, dead silence returned to the Gulf of Oman, broken only by the steady, rhythmic hum of the cruiser's engines as it maintained its patrol. The immediate surface threat to the strike group had been neutralized with clinical, professional efficiency. USS Leyte Gulf resumed its station, its radar still sweeping the skies for any sign of a follow-up attack from the mainland. The strike on the Silkworm batteries had been more than a defensive measure. It was a clear demonstration of the absolute reach and precision of American sea power. While the Iranian forces on the coast scrambled to assess the catastrophic damage to their batteries, the cruiser prepared to transition its focus. The next phase of the operation would require coordination with the carrier to support medical evacuation of the wounded from the scorched hangar deck of USS Kearsarge. 8:15 in the morning. The flight deck of USS Kearsarge, the once pristine gray non-skid surface, was now a scarred graveyard of white chemical foam and blackened debris. But the mission had already shifted from damage control to the preservation of life. Two MH-60 Sierra Seahawk helicopters, their rotors already blurring into translucent discs, sat waiting at spots 1 and 2 on the forward deck. The air was a cacophony of whistling turbines and the urgent shouting of flight deck sailors in green and white jerseys. The environment was a stark contrast of high-technology medicine and the raw, industrial smell of a ship that had narrowly escaped total destruction. On the hangar deck below, the fleet surgical team had established a primary triage station near the forward elevator. The air here was cool and smelled of antiseptic, a sharp departure from the acrid stink of the fire that still lingered in the ventilation ducts. 11 personnel had been categorized as Priority 1 urgent, requiring immediate surgical intervention that exceeded the ship's onboard capabilities. These were the sailors who had stood their ground against the initial fireball. Men and women with second and third degree burns covering 40% of their bodies, and others with deep shrapnel wounds from the missile's fragmentation sleeve. The corpsmen moved with mechanical precision, their boots splashing through the remaining firefighting foam as they carried the wounded on lightweight carbon fiber stretchers. Each patient was accompanied by a portable ventilator and a stack of electronic monitors that beeped in a rhythmic, frantic staccato. The A5 medical evacuation protocol was now in full effect. This was not a simple transport mission. It was a flying intensive care unit operation designed to keep the critically injured stabilized while transiting hundreds of miles of open ocean. As the first stretcher was lifted into the cabin of the MH-60 Sierra, the flight surgeon adjusted a blood transfusion bag, hanging from the helicopter's internal rack. Vampire 30, you are cleared for immediate departure, the air boss announced from the primary flight control tower. The helicopter surged upward, its nose dipping as it gathered airspeed, racing toward a secure airfield in Oman. From there, the wounded would be transferred to a C-17 Globemaster III aircraft, specially configured for the long-haul flight to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. The logistics of the iron flow were working exactly as designed, a chain of survival that stretched halfway across the globe. While the medical evacuation was underway, the logistics of the battle were far from over. USS Kearsarge had exhausted nearly 60% of its onboard supply of aqueous film-forming foam during the 3-hour fire. Its internal magazines were also depleted of rolling airframe missiles. To maintain the ship's combat readiness, an underway replenishment was mandatory. 10 miles to the west, the supply ship, USNS Supply, was already closing the distance at 25 knots, its massive fuel and cargo rigs prepared to execute a high-speed transfer. The two ships began the delicate maneuver of station keeping, running parallel to each other at a distance of only 180 feet. Despite the 2-meter swells and the constant threat of further Iranian airstrikes, the crews began the UNREP process. Heavy-duty nylon lines were shot across the gap between the ships using pneumatic line throwers. Within minutes, massive hoses and pallet transfer cables were tensioned between the two moving mountains of steel. Thousands of gallons of JP-5 aviation fuel began to flow through the thick rubber hoses, replenishing the Kearsarge's empty tanks. Simultaneously, pallets of bottled oxygen, medical supplies, and 500 canisters of firefighting foam were moved across the High Line. The deck of the supply ship was a hive of activity, with forklifts darting between rows of crates, ensuring that the amphibious assault ship received every spare part and every gallon of propellant needed to stay in the fight. This was the hidden engine of American naval power, the ability to repair, refuel, and rearm while still in the combat zone. While the strike fighters from the USS Abraham Lincoln were dismantling Iranian air defenses, the logistics teams were ensuring that the fleet remained a self-sustaining force. Every bolt, every unit of plasma, and every gallon of fuel was accounted for in a digital ledger that stretched back to the United States Indo-Pacific Command headquarters. By 9:30 in the morning, the final stretcher had been loaded onto the long-range transport aircraft on the mainland, and the last fuel hose had been disconnected from the side of USS Kearsarge. The ship was once again a fully capable combat platform, its fires out, its magazines replenished, and its wounded in the hands of the world's best trauma surgeons. The cost of the morning's engagement was heavy, but the professional resilience of the United States Navy had prevented a tragedy from becoming a strategic defeat. 9:45 in the morning. The sky over the Strait of Hormuz was etched with the white condensation trails of 48 Tomahawk cruise missiles, launched from the vertical launch systems of the cruiser USS Leyte Gulf and the destroyer USS Mason. The missiles were flying at 50 feet above the wavetops, using terrain contour matching to navigate the rugged Iranian coastline. The environment was one of clinical, automated destruction. The missiles moved in a silent, staggered formation, their small turbofan engines humming as they followed a pre-programmed path toward the Bandar Abbas airbase at coordinates 27 degrees 15 minutes north, 56 degrees 16 minutes east. As the first wave of Tomahawks crossed the shoreline, the Iranian air defense operators attempted to activate their remaining short-range radar systems. However, the EA-18 Gulf Growlers, still orbiting offshore, immediately detected the electronic signatures and flooded the frequencies with high-powered digital noise. The Iranian missiles that were launched flew blindly into the sky, their seekers unable to find a lock in the chaotic electromagnetic environment. The digital door remained wide open as the Amphibious cruise missiles accelerated for their terminal phase, their onboard GPS receivers refining their impact points to within 3 meters of the designated targets. The first Tomahawk punched through the reinforced concrete roof of the primary maintenance hangar at the western edge of the airfield. The 1,000-pound blast fragmentation warhead detonated inside the structure, which was currently housing 6 F-4 Phantom jets being readied for a second strike. A massive orange fireball erupted instantly, venting through the hangar doors, and sending a column of black smoke 3,000 feet into the clear morning sky. The heat was so intense that the steel support beams of the hangar began to melt and buckle, causing the entire roof to collapse onto the burning aircraft below. Seconds later, 6 more Tomahawks impacted the main runway and the parallel taxiway. These missiles were equipped with submunitions designed to crater the asphalt and prevent any aircraft from taking off or landing. The detonations occurred in a perfectly straight line, turning the 3,000-meter runway into a jagged landscape of broken concrete and deep pits. 4 Iranian J-20 stealth fighters attempting to taxi from their hardened shelters were trapped on the apron. They were immediately targeted by the second wave of FA-18 Super Hornets, which had arrived over the target area at 15,000 feet. The Super Hornets released 24 Joint Direct Attack munitions, each a 2,000-pound bomb guided by satellite signals. The pilots watched on their infrared targeting pods as the bombs glided toward the flight line with terrifying precision. One JDAM struck the center of the fuel farm, where 8 massive tanks held over 2 million gallons of aviation kerosene. The resulting explosion was a catastrophic event that shook the ground for 5 miles in every direction. A wall of fire, 500 feet high, rolled across the northern section of the base, incinerating everything in its path, including 3 radar vans and a battery of surface-to-air missiles. By 10:15 in the morning, the Bandar Abbas airbase had ceased to be an operational military facility. The damage assessment, relayed via real-time satellite imagery to the Carrier Strike Group, was comprehensive. 3 maintenance hangars were destroyed. The primary control tower was a blackened shell, and both runways were rendered unusable for at least 72 hours. 14 enemy aircraft had been destroyed on the ground, and the base's primary radar and communication nodes were obliterated. The smell of burning rubber, jet fuel, and scorched earth hung heavy over the ruins of the airfield, visible as a massive black plume from 50 miles away. The 12 Super Hornets banked hard to the west, climbing back to 30,000 feet for the return flight to USS Abraham Lincoln. Their mission was accomplished with 0 American aircraft lost and no personnel injured during the strike phase. The pilots could see the white wake of the Carrier Strike Group on the distant horizon, a small patch of order in a sea that had become a theater of war. The retaliatory phase of Operation Sentinel Resolve was over, and the focus now shifted to the final assessment and the long-term stabilization of the region. 10:30 in the morning, the North Arabian Sea. The heavy black smoke that had once towered over USS Kearsarge had finally thinned to a faint gray wisp, drifting slowly toward the eastern horizon. The 84,000-ton amphibious assault ship sat low in the water, a massive steel island scarred by fire and high explosives, but still defiantly afloat. The environment was one of exhausted, professional silence. The only sounds were the distant hum of the ship's remaining generators and the rhythmic slap of the sea against the scorched hull. The morning air, though still hot, felt cleaner now that the smell of burning jet fuel had been suppressed by thousands of gallons of firefighting foam. On the bridge, the commanding officer looked out over the forward flight deck. The damage was severe, but localized. A jagged, 20-foot hole marked the point where the Iranian missile had punched through the starboard side, but the ship's watertight integrity remained intact. Below the waterline, the engineering teams had confirmed that the main propulsion shafts were undamaged, though the ship was limited to a speed of 5 knots due to electrical failures in the forward distribution nodes. At coordinates 24 degrees 35 minutes north, 58 degrees 12 minutes east, the decision was made to begin the transit to the naval base at Bahrain for permanent repairs. The destroyer USS Mason moved into position 500 yards ahead of the wounded capital ship. A massive, 10-inch thick nylon towing hawser was passed between the 2 vessels, a physical umbilical cord that would guide the Kearsarge through the narrow waters of the Persian Gulf. The transition was slow and methodical, a testament to the seamanship of the crews who had been awake for over 24 hours. Surrounding the 2 ships, the rest of Carrier Strike Group 12 maintained a high-readiness defensive screen, their radars still sweeping the empty skies for any sign of a follow-up attack. Inside the Combat Direction Center, the final engagement report was being finalized for transmission to the Indo-Pacific Command. The data reflected a decisive, lopsided victory for the United States Navy. The Iranian losses were catastrophic. 14 aircraft destroyed on the ground at Bandar Abbas, 3 F-14 Tomcats shot down in air-to-air combat, and 2 F-4 Phantoms destroyed during the initial strike. Additionally, 4 Silkworm missile launchers, 3 coastal radar stations, and a primary aviation fuel farm had been obliterated. The Iranian air defense network in the southern sector was effectively non-existent, rendered blind and deaf by the electronic warfare of the Growlers and the precision of the Tomahawk cruise missiles. The cost to the United States was listed with sober honesty. 11 sailors had been critically injured, 3 of whom remained in guarded condition at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center. 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters had been lost to the fire, and USS Kearsarge would require at least 6 months of dry dock repairs before it could return to active service. However, the strategic objective had been achieved. The Carrier Strike Group had demonstrated that any strike against a United States naval vessel would be met with an immediate, overwhelming, and systematic destruction of the aggressor's military infrastructure. As the sun reached its zenith, the formation of ships began its long journey north. The wake of the USS Mason and the Kearsarge stretched out behind them, two white lines on the deep blue face of the sea. On the flight deck of the carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, a single Fa-18 Super Hornet stood on the catapult, its pilot maintaining a combat air patrol to ensure the safety of the towing operation. The pilot looked down at the ships below, seeing the charred remains of the Kearsarge's hangar deck, and then looked toward the Iranian coast, where the black smoke from the Bandar Abbas airbase was still visible on the horizon. The engagement, which had begun with a sudden, violent strike in the pre-dawn darkness, ended with the absolute dominance of American sea power. There was no celebration among the crews, only the quiet, grim satisfaction of professionals who had done their jobs under the most extreme conditions. The Arabian Sea was once again open for navigation, the threat of the coastal batteries removed by the precision of modern warfare. The United States Navy remained the master of the horizon, a shield for its allies and a hammer for its enemies. The final report was transmitted at 11:15 in the morning. The digital packets of data raced across the satellite network, carrying the details of the battle to the highest levels of the Pentagon. The message ended with a simple tactical status: Operation Sentinel Resolve complete. Area of operations stabilized. Strike group maintaining station. The war, for today, had been won.